bem-vinda, bem-vindo e bem-vinde ao Innovation Festival da Fast Company Brasil. Eu sou a Claudia Penteado, eu sou editora da Fast Company Brasil e eu tenho a honra de receber para uma conversa sobre futuros possíveis a editora-chefe da Fast Company, Stephanie Mehta. Ela ocupa essa posição desde 2018 e antes foi editora adjunta da Vanity Fair, trabalhou na Bloomberg Media, passou 14 anos na Fortune, foi repórter do Wall Street Journal e hoje ela é também diretora do Women's Forum of New York e faz parte do comitê do Airbell Impact Lab, a equipe de inovação do International Rescue Committee, uma entidade que existe há quase 100 anos e que ajuda refugiados no mundo inteiro. Stephanie, thanks for being here. It's an honor to have you with us.
Claudia, it's my honor. Thank you so much for having me.
So, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about your career? I mean, how you got into journalism and how you got into the business side of things?
Well, it's a very long story, but I'll try to make it quite short. But I attended Northwestern University, which has a wonderful journalism school, but I started out as an English major. And actually did end up getting my degree in English, but was surrounded by a group of friends who were all aspiring journalists, and they all wrote for the college paper. And so one day I just sort of followed them into the college paper because what they were doing seemed so interesting to me. I was fascinated by the fact that they could go in one afternoon and then the next morning they would have an article in the printed on everyone's doorstep at the school. It was just something that I thought was amazing, that you could, you know, as somebody whose writing was usually limited to term papers and long research projects, the idea of the quick turnaround I found really appealing. And so, but because I was this non-journalism major trying to make my way with all of these kids who knew they wanted to be reporters from the time they were, you know, babies, I sort of took what was available. And so no one else was writing about business for the school paper. So I sort of grabbed that as a way to find my way among all these other students who wanted to cover the student government or write about the protests against the college administration. And I really fell in love with business journalism. I thought it was, it struck me as a really interesting lens into a lot of different parts of the community that weren't being covered. You could tell all those stories through business.
So what was your mission when you first arrived at Fast Company in 2018?
I think what I wanted to try to do when I arrived at Fast Company is broaden our definition of innovation. There had been a very robust period of startup activity coming out of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Once the economy started to turn around, by 2010, you just saw this rush of new business creation. And Fast Company justifiably, you know, really helped elevate and tell the stories of companies that were pioneering direct-to-consumer businesses, social media, different kinds of platforms. And that was a smart news story to be chasing at the time. But by the time we got to 2018, people were starting to ask questions about the ethics and the caliber of business practices at some of the big tech companies. People were starting to ask questions about whether or not social media are healthy for not just young people, but for all users. And so for me, I think it was a combination of wanting to shine a spotlight on innovation that had kind of gone sideways, but also trying to tell a broader palette of stories of innovation. And so one of the first stories I greenlit when I got to Fast Company was a piece about McDonald's, the gigantic restaurant chain, and how they were trying to introduce fresh beef into hamburgers, and how that was a big logistical and process innovation challenge, and how they did it. I think that many people would say McDonald's is not a fast company story, but in my mind, a story of trying to reinvent and innovate at scale is a story that anyone can learn lessons from.
So anticipating things, how is that challenge today? I mean, what is Fast Company all about today? And what do you think has mostly changed in the coverage in the business world?
I would say that there are a couple of changes. One is that on the business side of our business, there are many, many more competitors. For a long time, your competition would be, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, to a certain extent, CNBC, Bloomberg. It would be other big media organizations. We have seen the rise of newsletters. We've seen the rise of individual contributors through Substack and some of these, sort of individualized programs. And so I think that, you have writers who can go very deep on a very narrow subject, and it can be difficult to compete with them because they are very single-minded in their focus. So I think that is one big change in the world of business news coverage. I would say the other thing, and I view all of these things as positive, by the way. I think it's great to have more people interested in the story of business. But I do think that you're seeing more mainstream publications who didn't really invest in their business coverage realize that business in some parts of the world, including the United States, is in some cases the biggest societal force there is. In the United States, and we see this worldwide, consumers say they trust business more than they trust government. They trust business more than they trust religion. And so business wields incredible power. And as a result, again, publications that really had, just one or two people covering business are suddenly investing more and more money into the space as well. And, I think these are all good things. And then in terms of, the way we cover business, I think the challenges have been that, certainly during the pandemic, it has been harder to find news sources and to meet new people and to tell new stories. I am guilty of this as much as anybody. I often find myself turning to people I know and people I trust because we developed that sourcing relationship offline. When you are meeting a new source over a teleconference for the first time, for one, I don't retain the information as well. I'll confess, I'll have a meeting with somebody and a lot of times it feels very transactional. It doesn't feel like we're building a relationship. And the other thing is that, a lot of the people that I rely on for information about the business world are people that I've known for, 2, 3, 4 years and have built those relationships in person over time. And so I think that has been challenging for people in our business is just, how do you find new sources and build new relationships when you can't have a cup of coffee together.
Yeah, but that's changing already, right? Are you already out there having cups of coffee?
I am having cups of coffee. I'm in my office today. So yes, I think it is starting to change, but it has been a challenging period for reporting.
Yeah. So is design, the concept of design applied to business in the center of the coverage that you choose to do?
I wouldn't say it's the center of our coverage, but I think it's a through line. I think you will see the concept of human-centered approaches kind of pervade everything we write about. I mean, if you think that design thinking is really about putting humans at the center of the process and the conversation, yes, then I would say that, yes, we absolutely, we want to understand how business processes, decisions, innovations, inventions, what that ultimately means for humanity and for society.
Yeah, I'm especially in love with the magazine. So how have you balanced what goes into the magazine and your daily coverage?
The good news for us is that they are two very different media I think we feel very strongly that they serve different needs for our consumers and our readers. And so, the bulk of our newsroom is dedicated to digital. That is, we publish 250 stories a week, and there are people whose jobs it is to get up every morning and say, what's in the news and what are we going to put online today? And many times those same people are very deeply knowledgeable and very sourced on things like vertical farms, or design at social media companies, or they might know a lot about sustainable fashion. And so very oftentimes, as they're developing their expertise in the course of doing their daily posts, we'll tap them on the shoulder and say, what are you hearing that's really interesting about, a company trying to get virgin plastic out of their supply chain? And can we borrow you from digital for a few hours a day so that you can start working on a bigger story for the magazine? And there, with the magazine, it really is about, trying to give that big picture perspective, that it's not just a story about getting virgin plastic out of your supply chain, but it's a look at, it's a show, not tell narrative about how difficult it really is to make change in some of these industries like fashion, that have become so reliant on international global supply chains that were built at a time when people weren't caring about sustainability. And that's a story you can tell in a magazine that you wouldn't necessarily tell in a 600-word post online.
You feel the magazine is still very strong? I mean, how do you choose who becomes the cover, for example? I imagine that's very, very challenging to make that decision.
It is challenging, especially when you have only 6 covers a year. So, we went from being a monthly and having 12 covers to coming out 6 times a year. And so the real estate feels very precious. I think for us, it is a combination of, who best tells the story of the moment. And so, our last cover that we had a person on was a story about an architect named Jeannie Gang, who is, engaged in really interesting sustainable practices as she goes about, sort of remaking buildings and remaking landscape cityscapes. And if you look at the content of the issue, it is very much about the role of design in helping us address some of society's biggest problems. And so not only was her story compelling, but she stood for a lot of the themes that we were highlighting in the issue. So it is a combination of trying to tell the best stories, but also tell a story that highlights the bigger themes that we are capturing in some of the packages in our magazine. The only other thing I would say is that, we're very committed to making sure that our covers are diverse and inclusive. And so, we really do strive to have an equal number of men and women on the covers every year. And racial diversity is really important to us as well.
How many people did you say were involved in the editorial every day?
We have 50 full-time people working on both magazine as well as digital. But then there's, a dozen or more freelancers that we regularly work with, and, many, many more people who, work for the parent company who support us along the way.
Yeah, that's a lot. How do you choose these people? Like you said, a mix of senior editors, writers, freelance journalists, people who are doing interesting things. How do you choose who writes for Fast Company?
We really look for people who have a passion for the subject matter, and a passion for our approach to the subject matter. There are so many talented journalists out there, and like a lot of places, we definitely struggle to hire because really good people just get scooped up right away, or they're hard to dislodge from good jobs. So I'm grateful to everybody that comes to work for Fast Company. But I would say it is this combination of talent, but also passion. If you're not passionate about the subject matter or the material, we're not the right place for you.
In terms of innovation, what is your point of view of what is innovation today?
That's a big question. And I would say, for me, innovation really is about a willingness to be curious and entrepreneurial and inquisitive and risk-taking around virtually every aspect of business. Innovation to me is a value. It's not a thing. It's a mindset. And so when I think about innovation at companies, to me, it's not a new product or a new invention or even a new way of doing things. It's a set of beliefs around how you want to comport your business and how you want your culture to evolve. And so for me, that is, it starts with curiosity, but it also involves a certain amount of entrepreneurship and risk-taking and a kind of willingness to question the status quo. Now, the status quo may be right. It may be, sometimes if there's a reason why certain things are classics and we keep coming back to them. But without a willingness to question that status quo, it's very hard to be innovative.
Yeah, over the years, you have pointed out the best, the most innovative companies, and it's interesting to see how your choices have changed over the years. What has come to the plate? I think you already said some of it, but I imagine that things like sustainability and responsibility of being in the world, has probably become one of those values, right? For example, 10 years ago, you chose Uber, and I read an article which said that today Uber would never be in a list of the most innovative companies. So how do you see those new things that have come to the plate?
Yeah, and to be clear, the Uber example was specific to innovation by design. So
yes,
10 years ago, for the inaugural Innovation by Design list, Uber was one of the companies honored. And when you think about Uber 10 years ago, what the company had done in terms of applying design thinking to the problem of hailing a taxi, truly was groundbreaking and differentiating. But I think that, as we've discussed, it's not just enough to be groundbreaking and to be a differentiator. There has to be some other kind of benefit to the world, whether it is, now Uber would make the argument that we take drivers off the road who shouldn't be driving. Instead of getting behind the wheel, if you are intoxicated, you can take an Uber, and that saves lives. But we also look at the company's practices. We look at how a company comports itself in communities. There's just a number of factors that we try to factor into our decision making. And as I said I spoke with a group of communications professionals the other day, and I said, for us, if a company's killing it in terms of profits, that's just not enough. A company is supposed to grow profits. That for many years was the very purpose of a corporation, is to make money for its shareholders. That's not a Fast Company story. If you grew profits 10% year over year, good for you. That's great. That's not a story for us. If you grew profits 10% year over year, but you also found a way to, do low interest loans to communities that were desperately in need of loans, or you put your cash in a credit union instead of, holding it in another kind of bank. Those are the kinds of things that we want to reward.
So that would be your advice for startup companies and people who are starting their businesses right now? I mean, my question would be, what would be your advice in this particular moment, especially of reconstruction that we are going through? What advice would you give them to succeed?
I would say to startups, don't wait until you are a big company to start thinking about the values that you want your company to have. I mean, I would imagine that most entrepreneurs have a set of values that they feel deeply and that they bring to their organizations. But I hear from a lot of startups that, we'll worry about gender diversity when we get to be a little bit bigger. We'll worry about racial inclusivity when we get to be a little bit bigger. We'll start our foundation when we get to be a little bit bigger. I think, and I'm not the only person who has said this. Mark Benioff, who is the founder of Salesforce.com, routinely gives this advice to startups. It's like, plan the kind of company you want to be from day one and start putting in the processes necessary to achieve that from the very beginning. Don't wait until you're bigger to say, oh, we have to diversify our board, or, oh, we really need to start bringing more women in tech. Like, make that a priority from the beginning.
And what do you think big companies can learn from startups as well?
I think big companies, as much as they say that they understand how important it is to act with urgency, they're just not set up to move as quickly as small companies. So I would encourage big companies to, figure out what it is that to try to embrace that sort of small company culture. And again, it comes back to, for me, innovation is a mindset. It's not just about saying we want to build great creative new things. It's, how do we instill in our organization that curiosity, that sense of inquisitiveness, and that willingness to take risks. Smaller businesses do take risks, and big businesses tend to be risk averse.
Mm-hmm. Can you reveal some of the companies and maybe people you admire who are doing things right at this moment in time?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a couple of people. Going back to what I had said earlier about being intentional about your values as a founder from day one. I've always been very impressed by Tory Burch, who is an American fashion designer. She has her own a fashion company that bears her name. She said she started her business specifically to be able to have a foundation. So from the minute she started her business, she was already thinking about the Tory Burch Foundation, which is really committed to helping create the next generation of female founders. And so, rather than wait until the company got to $500 million in sales or $1 billion in sales, which is, these landmarks, she said, the goal here is to start a foundation. And, she's had hundreds of women that have benefited from classes and fellowships and workshops that she's done through her foundation. So there is a spirit of sort of wanting to help the next generation. And so I think that has been a really tremendous thing that she's done. I just came from an event yesterday that honored Ken Frazier, who is now the chairman of Merck, which is a big American pharmaceutical company. And, Ken is one of a small number of Black American men leading Global 500 companies. And under his leadership and his stewardship, he has really driven home the message of diversifying your corporate board. And, Merck has long had a very diverse corporate board, but, he has been such a champion for this topic and, has used his pulpit to spread this message everywhere he goes. And, he is advocating on behalf of women and people of color, and has made a real difference.
Okay. Anyone else? It's
Um,
gonna make a lot of people jealous.
well, I feel like I picked two people who are very unimpeachable. So,
Okay. So, in terms of how you tell stories, it always seems to me that there's an effort of being almost minimalistic, being simple in a way. Is that a fact? Is this also a kind of a design decision applied to storytelling?
I would say that in the magazine, it really sort of depends on the story and the story topic. For the most part, we do try to be very very clear, and for the most part, very linear and very informative in our storytelling, while trying to delight the reader. Right? We want there to be delightful turns of phrase. We want the reader to feel like there are grace notes to the writing. Occasionally, it would be nice to make them laugh and to feel like they're part of they're in on the joke a little bit. But then we do have places in the magazine where we do want to have a little bit more of a voice. I think with shorter items, with the awards that we give, like most innovative companies, you have to be clear because you have to be so concise. But with some of our longer form stories, and I'm thinking about a profile that we wrote a few years ago that my coworker Mark Wilson wrote on Tyler, the creator, or his profile of the Snapchat CEO, Evan Spiegel. Those stories definitely have a tone and a voice and a point of view. And they're the kinds of stories that you might see in GQ or Esquire. They have a little bit more of a first person narrative to them. And I think Fast Company is a place that can make room for both.
Okay. Is there a specific reader that you're trying to reach? I mean, what does he look like, this person, he, she, whatever? What kinds of readers do you try to please or want to attract?
Well, I think there's a couple different types of readers that are attractive to us. I'll start by saying we love young readers. We value early career and even younger type readers. I'm always delighted when one of my teenage daughters says, "Oh, a Fast Company story showed up in my Instagram feed," because it means that another teenager posted it. I know they're not posting stories from Fast Company, but it's great when young people start to hear our brand and start to hear our name, because hopefully they'll come along for the ride with us when they really are looking for news and business content. So young readers are incredibly important to us, and we try to serve them in a number of ways. We have content on the website called Hit the Ground Running, which is early career advice. We really try to target a lot of those stories to the person who's in their first or second job, trying to navigate the workplace. We just find that content is incredibly valuable to them. And I think that demographic probably skews a little female, which is also great. We love our female readers. We're close to 50-50 in terms of gender distribution of our readers. And so but I think the other thing that's great about Fast Company is I routinely hear from people who bought that first issue of Fast Company in November 1995 and have stayed with us. They have continued to subscribe 26 years later. They still see value in what we write about. A lot of times they look to us to understand what a younger generation is interested in, right? They've matured into the Financial Times and the Economist and the Wall Street Journal, but they know that their young readers are reading Fast Company, and so they see us as almost a translator.
Interesting. Since you spoke about the female audience that you have, You helped launch the Founders Fair Conference for Women Entrepreneurs in 2017, and you work as a director of the Women's Forum in New York, right? Can you
Mhm.
tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the Founders Fair was a conference we did when I was at Vanity Fair, and we just saw that there was an opportunity, and I say this with great respect because my colleagues at Inc. magazine right down the hall have been doing a women's conference for many years, but it was targeting sort of a small to fast growing business demographic. With the Founders Fair, what we were really trying to do is convene the women unicorns, the founders of those entrepreneurial companies that had sort of reached that a slightly different status. And we were successful those first couple of years that we did it, in part because I think there was some curiosity about why is this luxury magazine Vanity Fair convening a conference for women entrepreneurs. But when you think about it, it was everybody from Reese Witherspoon, who has gone on to sell her business for $1 billion. But that you also had, Tory Burch, whom I mentioned earlier. I think her business is valued at, more than $3.5 billion. And then there were a lot of Silicon Valley women who were, had raised B and C rounds of money, who were aspiring. And of course, this was 2017. Fast forward to 2021, we've seen so many female-led companies go public in just this last year, whether it's Rent the Runway or Figs. So, I think we were early. I'm glad you asked about the Women's Forum of New York. The Women's Forum is a really great organization that was founded more than 50 years ago, back when, it really was rare for women to have a seat at the table in business. One of the earliest members was the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who at the time was a professor at Columbia Law School. And the group really set out to try to make sure that women had a seat at the table in business conversations, but also to give them sort of a safe space to have conversations among themselves and to do career development and mentorship. And so the Women's Forum of New York was the first of the chapters of what has now become the International Women's Forum. But it's a group that's terrific. And one of the reason I got involved in the organization is that every year there is a grant program that delivers cash grants. It's not a scholarship. They can use the money for whatever they want, to women over the age of 35 whose education has been interrupted for any reason. But it's oftentimes women who have gone through domestic hardship or have struggled with addiction, who had to stop going to college, and then, at 35 or older have decided to go back and pursue their higher education. This organization helps fund their schooling, and I'm proudest of that.
Oh, that's great. And how was your journey as a woman in the workplace? What sorts of challenges have you faced over the years?
I would say that the challenges I've faced are probably the challenges that any woman has faced. I feel like, first of all, I want to start by saying I feel very fortunate that I've had incredible allies and mentors, women and men alike, who have taken an interest in me and in my work and helped pave the way for me to try new things. I probably would never have become a magazine editor if, my then boss, Andy Serwer, hadn't come into my office and said, "What would you think about becoming an editor?" It really has been tremendous to have people recognize talent in me that I didn't know I had. And so that has been a big part of my journey. I would say the other challenge is, as I said, every woman faces this. You sometimes feel like you have to work harder to get the same opportunities, or to show that you are as good as your male counterparts.
Hmm. talking a bit about journalism specifically, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see today in the journalism scenario? How do you feel about where things are heading to in terms of uh, what kind of choices, maybe difficult ones for a journalist, did you have to make to adapt to a full digital model where what we do is called content and you have to interact with a new business model that has been created? What would you say about that?
Uh, There are a number of challenges, but I want to, start by saying I'm ultimately optimistic. I don't want that to get lost because I will list off a litany of challenges. But people ask me all the time if my kid is interested in journalism, should I dissuade them? And I always say no. I mean, it is the greatest career ever as far as I'm concerned. It's opened me up to so many opportunities, but I've been able to see parts of the world I would never see if I hadn't become a journalist. And I don't just mean exotic locations like, Chengdu, China, but I also mean, parts of the South of America that I would not have ever seen if I hadn't become a journalist. So I'm generally optimistic about it, certainly as a career for young people. There is a challenge that journalists face broadly around trying to stand out in the noise. There is a lot of misinformation out there. There is a lot of bad information out there, and we definitely struggle to make sure that people know the difference between Fast Company and a person's Facebook post that has information that may not be, well, it's probably certainly not vetted or fact checked. So trying to communicate to readers that we're a journalistic institution, that we don't just write the thing that comes to the top of our mind and push send, that there are checks and balances, that we have editors who read stories, that we do fact checking, that we verify information. And by the way, I don't blame the general public for not knowing any of this information. The editors and journalists do a terrible job of explaining our processes. So there's an opportunity there to show the world, to show our work, to show this is, I think in the same way that we're demanding more transparency from the people who make our clothes or the ways our cars are made, people are saying, let's have a blockchain so we can see the provenance of all of the parts of the supply. Like, I think journalism has room for transparency too.
Okay. And your job as an editor, has it changed very much? I mean, it seems like the work today is done more collaboratively. How do you see your role changing?
I would say that I'm much more, I'm even more engaged in the business side than I may have been 3 or 4 years ago. I think every editor-in-chief honestly is, so it's not unique to me, but the demands of making sure that we are creating not only good storytelling and a great platform for our readers, it is always balanced by trying to find ways to satisfy and create great sort of packages of storytelling for our advertisers and our underwriters. So I would say that, an even bigger part of my day is spent sort of thinking about building those relationships with our sponsors.
Okay. So where are you going to take the Fast Company brand over the next few years? It's hard to think long term. What's your agenda? What would you say?
I mean, I think that Fast Company is so uniquely positioned to tell great business stories, and to tell them on a lot of different platforms. A lot of the stories that we tell could work really well in documentary form. I'm so pleased to see that you have the Fast Company Innovation by Design book behind you. That has been a really exciting project to work on. I do think that books and podcasts and video storytelling are in our future. That name Fast Company gives us, and I mean us, you and me both, permission to tell stories in a lot of different formats and in a lot of different ways. So my hope is that we can stay true to our mission and vision of covering innovation and covering and being responsible journalists. But I think that we can also tell our stories in lots of different places.
Okay, so we're heading towards the end. I still want to ask you, you sit on the board committee of Airbell Impact Lab, right?
Yes.
It's the innovation team at the International Rescue Committee. What do you do there? Can you explain a little bit about your role there?
Yeah, so I'm a volunteer board member, and I think because of Fast Company's background in covering design, and this is sort of a design innovation lab, they were very excited to have somebody with a journalism and a design background, or at least not understanding of design, sit on the board. Airbell is a tremendous organization. It sits inside the International Rescue Committee, which is of course, doing incredible crusading work in places where there is any refugee crisis around the world, whether it's, Afghanistan now or Syria. IRC has feet on the street in all of these incredibly challenged areas of the world. And what Airbell tries to do is take on specific missions to serve that population. And so one of the big projects that Airbell is working on, for example, is, malnutrition. And how can you create better systems for measuring not extreme malnutrition, but, malnutrition at a point where it's really going to affect a child's development processes. And then, how do you get them the right nutrition they need so that they can grow up to be healthy? Those are design problems as much as they are logistics problems or healthcare issues. Trying to solve for a lot of these issues does revolve around design. And so, a lot of my conversations with the staff there are around, how can we tell their story? They're looking for ways to get additional funding, get additional support. And so a lot of times they look to me to say, how do we communicate the work we're doing here in a way that will make us fundable, but also where we can reach populations and governments who could use our help.
Wonderful. So, last question. What would you say are the biggest challenges for companies, for people facing the future today? I mean, in this time of reconstruction that we are living.
I don't know if it is the single biggest issue, but certainly something that is weighing on my mind is long-termism versus short-termism. There is probably, and I think we alluded to this a little bit, saying, oh, it's so hard to think so far into the future because everybody is so consumed with the day-to-day and just trying to sort of put out the problem or challenge that's right in front of them. But with reconstruction, we have an opportunity to rebuild our companies, our communities, our roads, our buildings, our cities. We can rebuild with the future in mind. I think too often we are very short-sighted. We try to build to solve the problem that's right in front of us. But, what if, as we think about, rebuilding our cities, we really are thinking about, sustaining them into the next 100 years. As we rebuild our businesses, let's not just think about making our numbers for the next quarter. How do you think about putting in the systems and infrastructure for the company that will make it, to use the words of the immortal Jim Collins, built to last?
Be good ancestors, right?
Yes. Be good stewards of our children's future.
Exactly. And I want to know what you're reading.
Oh,
I really want to know.
well, let's see. I actually have been rereading a book called The Secret History, which was a book I read 25 years ago by a then young writer named Donna Tartt. I've just become really, there have been a number of moments in culture where that book has popped up again in the cultural conversation. So I went back and I reread it. My nightstand is thick with other magazines. I do read I'm up to date on my Fast Companies, but I'm a big fan of obviously Inc., our sister publication. But I have about 3 weeks worth of New Yorkers to read. I have 2 New York magazines on my nightstand that I still haven't gotten to. I do love food and wine and Bon Appetit, so I subscribe to food magazines mostly for for inspiration. I don't actually ever cook anything that's in them. And the Economist is also sort of always that's more aspirational. I do try to skim articles, but don't read it cover to cover as much as I should.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. It was really very inspiring talking to you. Thank you for taking your time and being so generous.
Oh, thank you, Claudia. This was so much fun. And thank you for all the work you're doing at Fast Company Brazil. It's terrific to be partners with you.
It's lovely. I can say the same. You're very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigada para quem ficou por aqui. Essa foi a primeira conversa do dia. Ainda tem muitas conversas pela frente. Serão 2 dias de muita inspiração. Lembrando, compartilhe os nossos conteúdos nas redes sociais usando a hashtag FC Festival Brasil. Fiquem com a gente!